about you. Sound like Barry White. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. It's good to see you all anyway this morning. So this morning we're going to be looking at the story of Zacchaeus, who was a very little man, and a very little man was he who climbed up into a for the Saviour he wanted to. And when the Saviour came that way, he looked up into the tree and said, "Come on, down from the tree, because I'm coming to your house for tea." Now, you're probably too young for all that, aren't you? Yeah, okay. So anyway, before we go into the story of Zacchaeus, I thought we'd have a bit of nostalgia, and we'd look back at the 70s to start off with, which is, again, too young. I mean, yeah, Raish remembers the 40s, he remembers the war. So, I was born in 1968, so I consider the 80s my decade because that was my teen years. But I can remember the mid to late 70s quite well. So just for you two here, the average weekly wage in the 1970s was around £60 per week. The average house price was £4,975. It's a good job Rhodey and Jamie aren't here this morning to hear that. The biggest selling car was the Ford Cortina, which you could buy new for £963. Or if you were really well off, you could have a Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow for £9,272, so almost twice the price of an average house. Petrol started at 34 pence per gallon, so that works out about 7 pence per litre. So there's been quite a change. On TV, this is going to hurt you, this. We didn't have the multitude of channels we have now. There was only 3. We had BBC One, BBC Two, and ITV. We didn't get our 4th channel, Channel 4, until 1982. But even with so little channels, there was an abundance of cop detective shows on the television, and this is where I developed my love for these shows. I wanted to be Dave Starsky from Starsky and Hutch, because he knew how to rock a cardigan. He was he was cool. You should look it up, Abby, look it up. But there was loads of them for a few channels. There were so many shows on. There was, for example, there was The Streets of San Francisco, The Rockford Files, Cannon, McCloud, Starsky and Hutch, Hawaii Five-0, Columbo, and the one that came to my mind in preparing this sermon this morning. Dan, have you got that first picture? Who remembers this guy? Kojak. Theo Kojak, yeah. Now, he knew how to rock a lollipop. In fact, so popular was this show, they actually brought out Kojak Pops, so kids were walking to school with these in their mouth trying to be Kojak. But what I remember most about Kojak was his catchphrase, and can anybody remember what his catchphrase was? "Who loves you, baby?" That's how he finished the programme. Every episode finished with "Who loves you, baby?" And that's the thing, the one thing all humans need more than anything else is to know that we are loved. Without love, we feel worthless, unimportant, and useless. And we all need to feel useful and worthwhile, don't we? Because of this, we do have a tendency to compare ourselves with other people. I know I do. Sometimes we consider ourselves better than them, and sometimes we wish we were as good as they are. There are 4 things we base our level of importance on. Our appearance, do I look good enough? Our achievements, have I done enough? Our being approved by others, what will others think of me? Our wealth or power, am I important enough or powerful enough? Every one of these areas is based primarily upon one thing: where we rate ourselves in comparison to other people. We need to be loved, we need to be accepted, and we need to feel self-worth. But there is a problem with these 4 standards, and that is none of them are stable. They can all change depending on moment-to-moment circumstances. Appearances change with time. There will always be somebody who can do more than us and do it better than we can. How well others like you can change in the blink of an eye. Your affluence can change with one bad decision. The trouble with letting things like this dictate your self-worth is that your self-worth will always be changing, and you will never know from one moment to the next where you stand. And what do you think your self-worth will be when those things change? In February 1986, a Texas gemstone broker named Roy Wetstein was roaming the bins at the Tucson Gem Show when he came across a potato-sized stone that caught his eye. The seller said it was lavender agate, and he wanted $15 for it. Wetstein offered him $10, and they closed the deal. 9 months later, Wetstein announced his find to the world, a 1,905 carat star sapphire, the largest in the world. It was more than 700 carats larger than the previous record holder, the Black Star of Queensland, discovered in 1948. Wetstein said the gem was certified by the GIA and appraised at $2.28 million. It took a lover of stones to recognize the sapphire's worth, and it took the lover of souls to recognize the true value of people like you and me. If you want to build your self-image, build it on something that will last. Build it on what God thinks of you, not on what the world thinks of you. When we understand what God thinks of us, it changes the way we see ourselves, and that starts changing our hearts to be Christ-like. This morning, Jim read a very good example of that from the New Testament. It involves a man named Zacchaeus, and we are going to talk about him this morning. Zacchaeus was a man who lived in the city of Jericho. One day, Jesus came to Jericho, and Zacchaeus had an encounter with Jesus that changed his life. Verses 1 to 4 of Luke 9 tells us about that encounter. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. Dan, could you put that next picture on? The photograph on your notice sheet is, they claim, the sycamore fig tree in Jericho, which they say Zacchaeus climbed. Zacchaeus was hoping to see this Jesus, the man everyone was talking about. He didn't know it at the time, but he needed Jesus in the worst of ways. If there was ever a man who needed a stronger sense of self-worth, it was Zacchaeus. Because in the 4 ways we evaluate ourselves, he struck out in the first 3. His appearance was not the most beautiful to look at because of his very short stature. The only real achievement he ever had was overcharging people and cheating them for his own financial gain. And his approval rating was in the sewer because he collected taxes from the Jews and gave them to the Roman government. But he was wealthy. Firstly, to become a tax collector, you had to bribe an official. Secondly, Rome told you how much to collect, and if you were able to collect more, you could keep the extra. Zacchaeus was quite the talent at ripping off his fellow Jews, so he ended up being quite wealthy. For a Jewish man to become a Roman tax collector was unthinkable. It was like changing sides. For example, one of us joining the terrorists who are fighting against us today. You would be hated for being a traitor, and you could guarantee 3 things would happen should you become a Roman tax collector as a Jew. 1, your family would disown you. 2, you would never be allowed to worship in the synagogue. And 3, you would be considered worse than a murderer. As a result, Although Zacchaeus was incredibly wealthy, he was miserable on the inside. I know that because you can't have a guilty conscience and feel good about yourself at the same time. Zacchaeus knew he was ripping people off, and that would have caused him to lose most of his self-respect over a period of time. What we have here is a man who has a lot of money but doesn't like himself. But one day, that brief encounter with Jesus changed his life. Why? Because he learnt how much he mattered to God. If you are feeling a little down or a little empty today, you've come to the right place, because this is a place of hope. This is a place of Jesus Christ. And this is the place God wants you to be right now, his house. How do we know we can have hope even when things are going wrong? Because we know that we matter to God. This morning we are going to look at 3 truths, and if you remember these, I can guarantee you'll never again have problems with how you feel about your self-worth. So what is my first truth this morning? My first truth is this: Jesus notices you. No matter how badly I feel when nobody else seems to notice me, I know that Jesus notices me. Zacchaeus wanted to get a glimpse, but he was so short he couldn't see above the crowd. So Zacchaeus did 2 things that no wealthy Middle Eastern man would do. He ran through a crowd and he climbed a tree. These were things little boys might do, but not a well-known businessman. That was shocking enough, but what Jesus did was even more shocking. Jesus walks straight through the city, past thousands of people, and walks right up to that tree where Zacchaeus was and stops. Verse 5 says what happens. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." Why do you think Jesus did that? I think it was because Jesus knew Zacchaeus' heart, just like he knows your heart today. You might feel sometimes that you are up a tree, maybe even out on a limb, and you may think God has forgotten you. But in reality, there has never been a time where God has taken his eyes off you. He has seen every breath you've ever taken. He has felt every thought you have ever had, and he has seen everything you've ever done. God has always had his loving eyes upon your life, because God really does care about you. The truth is that we have a hard time imagining God paying that much attention to us, because we are guilty of often not paying that much attention to God. We may not be looking toward God every second of every day, but God is looking at us every second of every day. You might feel that others think you are worthless, but you matter so much to him that he let his son die for you. Think about that for a moment. Earlier in Luke 12, verse 7, Jesus said this, and it's a wonderful verse. "Indeed, the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Don't be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows." Just imagine, God thinks we are so valuable, he knows the number of hairs on our head. The deepest expression of love is attention. When you give somebody your attention, you're giving them your love. When you don't pay attention to your husband or wife or kids, you are actually being unloving. God is always paying attention to us. It may not seem like it to us because we really are not all that focused on him. But again, he is always focused on us. When children are little, they want to be noticed. So you often hear, "Watch me, mummy," or "Watch me, daddy," normally just before disaster occurs, such as falling off their bikes. And adults like to be noticed too. And just like children, we yell out, but we don't necessarily do it with words. We act in such a way to get other people's attention, or we dress with the goal of capturing other people's attention, like I have this morning. According to these two, I look like Hans Gruber from Die Hard this morning. Yeah. There you go. But what we are really doing is yelling, "Please watch me, somebody." For our own well-being, it is vital that we remember to stop depending on other people to feel worthy and to start depending on God. My second truth is this: Jesus lifts you up. All of his life, Zacchaeus had been ridiculed and rejected. We know that because the word used in Luke for short actually means a child's body that has not fully grown. And it would be safe to assume that he was the target of ridicule all of his life. And this may have something to do with the fact that he ended up corrupt and didn't care if he collected from the Jews and gave it to the Romans. Yet, Jesus looked up at Zacchaeus in front of this huge crowd and called him by name, which shocked everybody, because Jesus knew the name of the biggest scoundrel in town. But in spite of Zacchaeus' sin, Jesus lifts him up while everybody else is putting him down. In Ephesians 2, verse 10, it says this: "For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do." There are two types of artwork. There are prints, which are mass-produced on a large scale, all being identical. And then there are masterpieces, which are unique, that may have taken many months to complete. We are not mass-produced by God to be just like other people. By his own word, we are masterpieces, made unique and made for good purposes, God's purposes. If Jesus carried a wallet, he would carry our pictures in it. In Isaiah 49, verse 16, God says, "See, I have engraved you on the palms of my hands." When Jesus Christ looks at the scars in his hands, he sees your names. He doesn't need to carry our pictures because he has each one of our names written in the scars of his hands. I am sure there are some of you here that have had hurtful things said to you or done to you over the years. You may have been told that you are not worth anything, and as much as those things hurt us, we do have a tendency to carry these things around with us. We need to get rid of these weights that hold us back so we can live and focus on God rather than to keep living and focusing on our past hurts. And you can do this by realizing that you are special to Jesus. Where we say, "I can't see my value because of all that has happened to me," Jesus says, "I can see all your value in spite of all that's happened to you." When this world trips you up, it is only Jesus who lifts you up. My final truth this morning is this: Jesus wants you. I think one of the hardest things for us to understand is that no matter what we have ever done in our lives, Jesus still wants to have a personal relationship with us because he loves us. Zacchaeus felt the people's hatred because he was a cheat, and they hated him for it. So Jesus did something. He didn't just walk up to the tree and look up and notice him, and he didn't just call him by name and affirm him in front of those who hated him. He invited himself to Zacchaeus' home for dinner. Verse 7 says, "And the people saw this and began to mutter, 'He has gone to be the guest of a sinner.'" The truth is, we are a lot like Zacchaeus was. We have all done things that have hurt others. But Jesus is far more interested in changing us than he is in condemning us. So he looks at you and he says, "I know you, I love you, and I want you in spite of all that you've done. And I want you to love me and have a relationship with me." Remember the parable of the prodigal son. The father has two boys, and one of the boys is impatient and tells his father that he wants his inheritance now instead of waiting for his father to die. His father gives in to him, and he heads to the bright lights, and he spends all his money on wine, women, and song. He ends up dirt broke on the street and ends up getting a job feeding pigs in a pigsty. Eventually, he comes to his senses and heads home. He plans on telling his father that he is unworthy to be his son, and he plans on begging his father to hire him as a servant. The son sees himself as worthless. But what does his father do? His father sees him coming down the road and runs out to meet the boy, giving him the biggest bear hug imaginable. He did not lecture him and tell him how bad he was or how stupid he was. He told him how loved he was. Some people think that if they go to Jesus with all the dirt in their lives, Jesus will either lecture them or downright deny them. And the devil likes people to think that. There is a story that says God and the devil were talking, and God told the devil that he was going to take some things away from him. God said he was going to take sickness, poverty, and many other things away from the devil. And the devil said, no problem. Then, finally, God said he was going to take discouragement away from the devil, and the devil became unglued. The devil told God that was the best weapon he had. He said when everything else fails, all he had to do was throw a little discouragement in front of somebody, and they would always fall for it and lose focus of the truth. The devil uses discouragement in our lives to keep us from having a healthy and loving relationship with Jesus too. And the sad part is we always seem to fall for it. Let me put it another way. Right? Just beware of the cobwebs here, all right? Because I'm going to open my wallet. Right. In my hand I've got a nice crisp £10 note. Who would like it? Nobody? Nobody want? No? What if I did that, stamped on it, crumpled it up? Who'd want it? Who'd want it? Oh, this is good. I can't even give away money, can I? This is where you're supposed to go. The point is, no matter what this crisp £10 note has gone through, it has not lost its original value. And no matter what you have gone through before today, God still loves and wants you because he knows you have not lost your original value to him. Jesus says, those the Father has given me will come to me, and I will never ever reject them. God notices everything in your life. His eyes of love are constantly watching you, and he knows your value no matter what anyone else around you is saying about you. He knows the truth. They don't. God has a plan and purpose for your life. He made you and wants you in spite of the fact that you've rejected him in the past. How should you respond to that kind of God? The way Zacchaeus did. Verse 6 says, so he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. I like the New Living Translation here that says, Zacchaeus quickly climbed down and took Jesus to his house in great excitement and joy. With a God that offers so much love and eternal happiness, I think we should react in the same way as Zacchaeus did, with great excitement and joy. I cannot comprehend why anyone would refuse God when he is standing there with his arms open. Zacchaeus didn't waste any time taking up Jesus' offer of a relationship, and the change in him was instantaneous. Verse 8-9 says, Zacchaeus stopped and said to the Lord, behold, Lord, half of my possessions I will give to the poor, and if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will give back 4 times as much. And Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. Something had happened in Zacchaeus' heart, because the most selfish man in the city all of a sudden became the most generous man in the city. What happened? Jesus Christ and the love of God changed him. That's what happened. So to conclude, how do you know if you've really met Jesus Christ? Your attitudes change. You become of a more generous person. All of a sudden, you start thinking about other people. You realize how much you've been given, and you want to give it back. Too many people forget that everything they have is from God, and they want to hold on to everything they have. But when Jesus touches them, they start to think about what they can do to help others. We were made in God's image, and when we receive Jesus, we start changing to reflect that image. Zacchaeus publicly demonstrated his change of heart. He said he was going to give all the money he had overcharged back to the people. That was the first way he started showing the love he received from Jesus to others. And it is that love we receive through Jesus that makes up for all the hurts we have received before. Jesus knows you have been terribly hurt in the past. He knows that hurt is still with you even today. And he wants you to know that he loves you enough to take that hurt away. He loves you enough to set you free from it. I'll finish with one more story. There was a little girl whose mother was going to take her shopping. The father couldn't go, so he gave his daughter £5 to buy whatever she wanted. In one of the stores there was a necklace. It looked like real pearls, so she bought it. For the next week she wore those pearls everywhere, even when she took a bath. And she would tell everyone it was the necklace her daddy bought her because he loved her. After that first week, her dad would come in and tuck her into bed every night. He would tell her he loved her, and she would tell him she loved him. Then he would ask if she would give him the necklace. Each night she would say, no. This went on for several nights, and then one night, as he told her he loved her, she said she loved him too. But this time when he asked her if she would give him the necklace, she said, I love that necklace, Daddy, but I love you more. And she gave him the necklace. Then the dad reached into his shirt pocket and brought out a little box and gave it to her. When she opened it, she found a real pearl necklace. He had wanted to give her that gift, but had to wait until she loved him and trusted him enough to give him the fake necklace. And God is like that. When we give him all the focus we have been giving the world, he will give us something of far greater value in return. When we love him enough to give him all the hurts we have bundled up inside our hearts, he will replace it with his uplifting, grace-filled love, the love that soothes our souls. Do you love him enough to give him all of your hurts and disappointments? Do you trust him enough to open up your heart to him this morning? It doesn't matter whether you have ever responded to an invitation before. Jesus wants so desperately for you to respond to his invitation today. Will you do that for him? Amen.